Welcome to Wisdom Trek with Gramps. I am Guthrie Chamberlain, and we are on day 2686 of our trek. The purpose of Wisdom Trek is to create a legacy of wisdom, to seek out discernment and insights, and to boldly grow where few have chosen to grow before. Today we continue with our 9th of 16 segments in our Theology Thursday lessons. I am reading through the book Supernatural, written by Hebrew Bible scholar, professor, my mentor, the late Dr. Michael S. Heiser. Supernatural is a condensed version of his comprehensive book, The Unseen Realm. If these podcasts pique your interest, I'd recommend that you read The Unseen Realm. And today we'll be reading through Chapter 9, which is titled Holy War. The Bible is a controversial book. People who don't see it as the Word of God often object to what it has to say. But some parts of the Bible make even Christians uncomfortable. Israel's war to conquer the Promised Land is a case in point. Why? Mostly because of the killings. It seems indiscriminate and far too thorough. Why is it necessary to kill entire populations in some cities, men, women, children, and even livestock? Why not let the inhabitants surrender? Wouldn't it be better to have them in exile than to slaughter them? There's an answer to those objections, but I've discovered that the answer seems to make Christians more uncomfortable as the problem. You can only understand the rationale and motive of these conquest accounts when you see them through the supernatural worldview of an Israelite. We see it through Israel's supernatural logic. The battles for the Promised Land were framed by two factors, both deeply rooted in Israel's understanding that the world is not only the abode of humankind, but also the prize of the unseen spiritual war. We've talked about both of them already, but let's review. One factor is the fallout of the events at the Tower of Babel, when God decided, after the nations rebelled against him, that he would no longer want direct relationship with the people of those nations. Instead, he assigned members of his divine council, the sons of God, to govern them, according to Deuteronomy 4, verses 19 and 20, and Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 and 9. Afterward, he called Abraham and enabled him and his wife Sarah to have a child, Isaac, from whom the people of Israel would come. We learned in Psalm 82 that these lesser gods became corrupted. They allowed injustice. People came to worship them instead of the Most High God. Thus they became the enemies of God and his people Israel. Since some of these nations were within the land of Canaan, which God's purposed to give to the nation of Israel after the Exodus, Moses and the Israelites believed that these people who occupied these lands were mortal enemies, and their gods would do all that they could to destroy Israel. The second factor is even more frightening for the Israelites. It's best explained to what happened when the Israelites arrived at the border of Canaan, the Promised Land. Moses sent 12 spies into Canaan to report on the land and its inhabitants. The spies came back with evidence that the land itself was wonderful. It flows with milk and honey, just as God had told them in Numbers 13, verse 27. But then they dropped the bombshell in Numbers chapter 13, verses 32 through 33. The land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people we saw there are of great height. And we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. And we seem to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seem to them. Now we've talked about the Nephilim before. They were the sinister spawn of the sons of God and the daughters of humankind back in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. The Anakim giants that the Israelites saw in Canaan were their descendants, and there were more of them scattered throughout the land of Canaan, among the nations and the cities that the Israelites would have to defeat in order to take the land, according to Numbers chapter 13, verses 28 and 29. The task of conquering the land and its had seemed to be difficult before, but now it looked downright impossible. Now to take the land, they would have to face these warriors of an abnormal physical size. Only two of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, believed that God would help the Israelites defeat the Anakim. The rest persuaded the people that they would lose. Instead of trusting that God, the same God who had devastated Pharaoh and his army so thoroughly, would intercede and give him a victory, they whined instead in Numbers 13, verse 31, "We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we are." God replied, "How long will you people despise me? How long will you not believe in me, in spite of all the signs that I have done among them?" Numbers 14, verse 11. In fact, God was so angry that he threatened to disinherit Israel, the very thing that he had done to the nations at the Tower of Babel, and then start over again, this time with Moses. Numbers 14 verse 12 tells us, "I will strike them with a pestilence and disinherit them. I will make you a nation greater and mightier than they." Moses begged God to relent in Numbers 14 verses 13 through 19. God did, but he couldn't overlook the unbelief of the people. A lesson had to be learned. It would be harsh. And he told Moses in Numbers chapter 14, verses 20 through 31, "I have pardoned according to your word. But truly, as I live, and as all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord, none of these men who have seen my glory, and my signs that I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and yet have put me to test these 10 times, and have not obeyed my voice, shall see the land that I swore to give to their fathers, and none of those who despise me shall see it. Your dead bodies will fall in the wilderness, and all of your number, listed in the census, from 20 years old and upward, who have grumbled against me, not one shall come into the land where I swore that I would make you dwell, except for Caleb and Joshua the son of Nun. But your little ones, who said that they would become my prey, I will bring in, and they shall know the land that was rejected. 10 times is the figure of speech in the biblical days for time and time again. Genesis chapter 31, verse 7, and Job chapter 19, verse 3. To this point, God had been tolerant of the people's complaints. Instead of being thrilled to no longer be a bondservant in Egypt, they griped about the food that they had to eat in Numbers chapter 11, and about God's chosen leader, Moses, in Numbers chapter 12. But his patience had run out this time. Their unbelief would be at a terrible cost. Israel would wander in the desert for 40 years until all the adults who had not believed had died off. But God gave them a second chance also. Israel would get a second chance for taking the promised land. Deuteronomy chapters 2 and 3 chronicles how, during the 40 years of wandering, the Israelites wound up with the territory on the other side of the Jordan, called the Transjordan, which was east of the Promised Land. The Transjordan lands were Edom, Moab, and Ammon, territories that God had given to the descendants of Lot, Abraham's nephew, and Esau, Jacob's brother. The people who lived there were relatives of the Israelites, most of them anyway, but there were others. God had directed Moses to make the trip for a specific purpose. It wasn't about visiting distant relatives. The Israelites eventually made their way into the region known as Bashan, the place that had a terrifying reputation. In the ancient literature outside the Bible, Bashan was known as the place of the serpent. 2 of its major cities, Ashtaroth and Edrei, both mentioned in their connection with this journey, in Deuteronomy chapter 1 verse 4 and Joshua chapter 13 verse 12, were considered gateways to the underworld realm of the dead. In the context of Israel's supernatural worldview, God had led the Israelites to the very gates of hell. And that wasn't all. God had brought the Israelites to encounter the 2 kings there, Sihon and Og. These were 2 kings of the Ammonites, as listed in Deuteronomy chapter 3 and chapter 31. And they were rulers of what the Bible calls Rephaim. In Deuteronomy chapter 2 verse 11, ominously noted that the Anakim were also counted as Rephaim. God, through Moses, had led the people into another area occupied by the same sort of giants that had frightened the Israelite spies into unbelief years earlier in Numbers chapter 13. That very event had caused them 40 years of wandering. Why had God brought them there? Because of the confrontation was a foretaste of what would have to be done when the 40 years had ended. Israel would eventually have to cross the Jordan to occupy the land that God had given to them. God was testing his people. Would they believe and fight this time? If so, a victory would give them confidence and faith of what laid ahead. The Israelites had turned tail years earlier, but this time the story ended differently. As Moses said in Deuteronomy chapter 2 and 3, "The Lord our God gave Sihon over to us, and we defeated him and his sons and all of his people. The Lord our God gave into our hand Og, also the king of Bashan, and all of his people, and we struck him down until there was no survivors left." Deuteronomy chapter 2 and 3. The prophet Amos recounted the confrontation in his own biblical books many years later, and he described the outcome this way in Amos chapter 2 verse 9. "The Lord destroyed the Amorite before them, whose height was like the height of cedars, and who was as strong as the oaks." It was a rough way to start their second chance. God demanded that they face their fears. The terrors that had cost them 40 years of aimless wandering. They had the God who parted the Red Sea on their side. It was time that they remembered that. Next, we'll look at devoted to destruction. Now, Israelite won the day against Sihon and Og, and it was here that we get the first taste of why the conquest in the Promised Land at times involved annihilation. The entire populations of the cities that were home to the giant Rephaim were devoted to destruction, according to Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 6. The goal here was not revenge. The goal was to ensure the elimination of the Nephilim bloodlines. To the Israelites, the giant clan bloodlines were demonic, having been produced by rebellion, fallen divine beings. They could not coexist with the demonic heritage. Time passed, and before the Israelites crossed the Jordan into Canaan, Moses died. The leadership then was passed to Joshua, and he led many military campaigns in the Israelites' conquest of the Promised Land, and those campaigns were guided by 2 factors I noted earlier in this chapter. drive out the hostile enemy nations, and in the process, eliminate the giant clan bloodlines. Viewed in the context, the conquest of the Promised Land was a holy war, a battle against the forces of darkness and the enemies under the dominion of hostile gods and that the Bible says were real spiritual entities. The logic of the conquest is summarized well in Joshua chapter 11, verses 21 and 22. And Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debar, from Anab, and all of the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua devoted them to destruction within the cities. There was none of the Anakim left in the land of the people of Israel. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and Ashdod did some remain. And you once again might ask why this matters. Well, Joshua's campaigns were mostly successful, but not complete. A few giants escaped, and while they may have not seemed very important, it foreshadowed the events to come. Some of those giants wound up in Gath. Gath was a Philistine city, according to Joshua chapter 13, verse 3, and was the hometown of Goliath at the time of King David in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 4. Goliath wasn't the only giant in Gath either. 1 Chronicles chapter 20, verses 5 through 8, tells us that not all those who had been devoted to destruction during the conquest of the Promised Land were in fact destroyed, and the fact of this conquest didn't accomplish all of its prime directives had consequences for the Israelites. The book of Judges tells us that the conquest was incomplete in other ways at the time that Joshua died. It was never fully realized. The Israelites decided that they had done enough and disobeyed God's command to drive out the other nations. But partial obedience is always disobedience. The Israelites would spend centuries paying for their decision to stop short of God's goals. The book of Judges reiterates this awful cycle. Israel was repeatedly overwhelmed by hostile nations, and believing loyalty in God was nearly extinguished. Things did improve by the time of King David and his son Solomon, but once Solomon was gone, Israel disintegrated into civil war and idolatry. The glory of the conquest was overshadowed by this epic failure. Defeat was snatched from the jaws of victory. God's kingdom rule, his plan for restored Eden, went down in flames. The supernatural worldview that emerged at Babel, with unbelieving nations under the dominions of evil gods, remained intact. Israel was defeated and scattered, and her promised land came under the rule of other gods and their people. The same worldview permeates the New Testament too. Paul uses the term like principalities, authorities, thrones, and powers to describe the forces of darkness. Each of those terms was used in antiquity to refer to the geographical rule. The cause of the Israelites' failure was disobedience and faithlessness on the part of God's people. Humans are weak. We might wonder why God bothers with us at all. But if we look back to Eden, we know why. God had committed himself to humanity. We are his imagers and his earthly family. His original plan for ruling earth included us. For God to cast aside his human participation in his council rule on earth would send a message that he was unable to make it work or that it was a bad idea to begin with. God is not incapable of achieving his own goals, and as mentioned in earlier chapters, he doesn't make mistakes. It was time for a new approach to an old problem of sin and failure. Humanity could not be trusted with reviving the Edenic kingdom rule. Only God himself could do what is needed to be done. Only God can meet the obligations of his covenants. But humanity would not be set aside. Instead, God would have to become a man. God would have to fulfill the law and the covenants himself, and then take upon him the penalty of all human failure. But pulling this off was an unthinkable solution. It meant that it would have to be kept a secret from everyone, including the intelligent supernatural beings hostile to his purposes. And that wasn't going to be easy. And that's the end of the chapter for this podcast. Join us the next time on Theology Thursday as we explore Hidden in Plain Sight. And if you found this podcast insightful, please subscribe and leave us a review. Then encourage your friends and family to join us and come along with us tomorrow for another day of Wisdom Trek, creating a legacy. Thank you so much for allowing me to be your guide, your mentor, and most importantly, I am your friend as I serve you through the Wisdom Trek podcast and journal. As we take this trek of life together, let us always live abundantly, love unconditionally, listen intentionally, learn continuously, lend to others generously, lead with integrity, and leave a living legacy each day. I am Guthrie Chamberlain, reminding you to keep moving forward, enjoy your journey, and create a great day every day. See you next time for more daily wisdom.